Imagine this. You live in a huge country, occupying 1/6 of the planet's landmass. This power launches spacecraft, possesses nuclear weapons, and competes with the world's most powerful economy. And suddenly, one night, one explosion at a nuclear power plant somewhere on the border of Ukraine and Belarus, and 5 years later, this country is already gone from the map. Sounds like the plot of a science fiction novel, doesn't it? But this is precisely how events that economist Nassim Taleb called black swans work. Before Europeans discovered Australia, no one could imagine that swans were black. Everyone was sure that these birds were exclusively white. The discovery of black swans overturned that certainty in one instant. A black swan, in Taleb's understanding, is an event that possesses three properties. Firstly, it is incredibly rare, falling outside the scope of normal expectations. Secondly, it carries colossal consequences that change everything around it. And thirdly, the most interesting thing, after it happens, people begin finding explanations that make it seem predictable and logical. We look back and think, of course this had to happen. All the signs were there. History knows many such black swans. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914th year. Who could have thought that one shot from a 19-year-old student would trigger a chain reaction leading to the First World War and the collapse of four empires? The attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941st year changed the course of the Second World War. The terrorist attacks of September the 11th, 2001 year redrew global politics for decades to come. But let's return to the Soviet Union in the mid-80s. Outwardly, everything looked stable. Yes, the economy was growing slower than desired. Yes, there was a shortage of goods on store shelves, and lines had become a familiar part of life. Yes, the war in Afghanistan was dragging on and draining resources. But could anyone have imagined that the enormous superpower, which had survived the Civil War, industrialization, the terrible war against fascism, would collapse in less than a decade? By the beginning of 1986th year, the USSR was in a difficult position. Oil prices, the main source of foreign currency earnings, had collapsed. The planned economy was stalling. Enterprises produced what the plan required, not what people needed. The technological gap with the West was becoming increasingly noticeable, but the system seemed unshakable. The Communist Party controlled everything. The KGB monitored any dissent, and the army was one of the strongest in the world. And then, April the 26th, 1986th year, Chernobyl nuclear power plant, unit number 4, 1 hour, 23 minutes, and 47 seconds past midnight Moscow time, two powerful explosions tear apart the reactor, releasing radioactive substances into the atmosphere. A column of fire and molten materials soars to a height of more than 1 kilometer. That night, few people understood that something more than just an accident at a nuclear power plant had just occurred. It was that very black swan that would trigger a chain reaction of events leading to the collapse of the system. The catastrophe would expose all the weaknesses of the Soviet regime, the habit of suppressing problems, the inability to respond quickly to crises, the gulf between official propaganda and reality, technological backwardness, and the disregard for human lives for the sake of fulfilling the plan. But here is the paradox. Was the Chernobyl catastrophe a true black swan, an unpredictable event, or was it an inevitability that people simply didn't want to see? Accidents had already occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. On September the 9th, 1982nd year, during a test run of the first power unit, a reactor process channel was destroyed, the active zone partially melted down, and radioactive substances were released. But few people knew about this. The information was classified. RBMK-type reactors, which were installed in Chernobyl, had design flaws that specialists were aware of. Under certain conditions, they could become unstable, and go into an uncontrolled power surge. But these reactors were cheaper than their Western counterparts. They could be built faster, and the plan required increasing nuclear power capacity. The culture of safety was sacrificed for the sake of fulfilling planned targets. Plant personnel did not always receive full information about the risks. Safety systems were sometimes disabled so as not to interfere with work. And all this against the backdrop of an ideology that asserted the superiority of Soviet science and technology. So what was Chernobyl? Accident or inevitability? A black swan or a predictable catastrophe? Could the Soviet Union have survived the 90s if the experiment on the fourth power unit had been successful that fateful night? Or was the collapse of the system inevitable, and Chernobyl merely accelerated what was bound to happen anyway? In this story, we must figure out how one accident at a nuclear power plant became an economic catastrophe that undermined the foundations of the superpower. We will look at the direct losses, hundreds of billions of dollars, hundreds of thousands evacuated, huge territories turned into an exclusion zone. We will see how the accident triggered a systemic crisis in the energy sector and industry. We will understand why the suppression of the truth in the first days after the explosion inflicted a political blow from which the Soviet government could not recover. And finally, we will try to look into an alternative history. What would have happened if everything had gone according to plan that spring night? Could the USSR have been preserved, avoiding this catastrophe? Or was the fate of the empire already predetermined by other factors? Economic stagnation, national contradictions, the lost technological race with the West? To understand how one accident at a nuclear power plant could hit the superpower's economy so hard, we need to go back 2 decades and see what hopes the USSR pinned on nuclear energy. In the 70s of the last century, the Soviet leadership faced a problem that even the most powerful planned economy could not solve. Industry demanded more and more electricity, cities grew, consumption increased, and traditional sources, coal and hydroelectric power plants, could not cope with the pace of growth. Building new hydroelectric plants was expensive and time-consuming, and there were fewer suitable rivers left. Thermal power plants devoured coal and fuel oil, polluted the air, and required constant fuel supplies. And here, nuclear energy looked like a gift of fate. Imagine, one nuclear fuel load, and the reactor works for years, generating huge capacities. No smoke, no trainloads of coal, no dependence on the weather, as with hydroelectric plants. Clean, modern, almost magical energy. The Soviet Union had every reason to be proud of its achievements in this area. In 1954th year, the world's first nuclear power plant was launched in Obninsk. Yes, the capacity was modest, only 5 megawatts, but it was a breakthrough, proof that peaceful atom was real. By the mid-70s, ambitions had grown manifold. The State Planning Commission, the very Gosplan that determined the fate of the entire Soviet economy, developed the most ambitious program. By the end of the 80s, dozens of nuclear power plants were supposed to be operating in the country. The plan provided that by the end of the 10th five-year plan, that is, by 1980th year, nuclear power plants would supply about 10% of all electricity in the country. Nuclear power plants accounted for 20% of all newly commissioned capacity. These were not just figures on paper. Grand construction was unfolding across the country. Leningrad NPP, Kursk, Smolensk, Chernobyl, Balakovo, Rivne, Ignalina, Armenian, the list goes on. Moreover, they were building not only in the European part, stations were planned in Siberia, the Far East, Crimea, and Kazakhstan. The USSR actively exported its nuclear technologies to countries of the socialist camp and even further. Nuclear power plants with Soviet reactors were built in Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and Finland with Soviet assistance. Construction began in Poland and Cuba. Nuclear energy became a symbol of technological progress, a source of pride, proof of the superiority of socialism. After all, the first nuclear power plant was built precisely by us, Soviet engineers and scientists. School textbooks talked about the peaceful atom as a great achievement. Newsreels showed modern stations, white reactor buildings, and happy operators at control panels. But behind this ceremonial facade lay a more prosaic reality. The main reason for relying on nuclear energy was economic feasibility, or rather, the appearance of it. Soviet RBMK-type reactors, the ones installed in Chernobyl, were designed with an eye on cheapness and speed of construction. RBMK stood for High Power Channel Type Reactor, Reactor Bolshoi Moshnosti Kanalny. Its design radically differed from Western counterparts. Instead of a massive, high-pressure steel vessel used by Americans and Europeans, Soviet engineers created a modular system. Hundreds of channels passed through a graphite block, through which water circulated, cooling the fuel and turning into steam. On the one hand, this was a brilliant engineering finding. There was no need to make a gigantic vessel of special steel, a technology that had been refined in the West for decades. The reactor could be assembled on-site, like a constructor, from individual elements. Fuel could be reloaded without shutting down the entire reactor. And most importantly, power. The RBMK 1000 unit delivered 1,000 megawatts of electrical power, and the later version, RBMK 1500, delivered 1,500 respectively. But there was also a flip side. RBMK reactors had a design feature that few non-specialists knew about. Under certain operating conditions, at low power, they became unstable. There was a so-called positive steam void coefficient of reactivity. It sounds complicated, but the essence is simple and frightening. If more steam started forming in the reactor, the chain reaction accelerated, more heat was generated, even more steam formed, and the process could spiral out of control. Western reactors were designed with a negative coefficient, where a rise in temperature automatically slowed the reaction. This is called passive safety. The laws of physics work for you. In RBMK, however, under certain conditions, the laws of physics worked against you. Engineers knew about this. Moreover, after the launch of the first RBMKs, other problems were also discovered, but no one was going to stop the program. A plan is a plan. The country needed electricity here and now, not 10 years later when safer designs would be developed. In addition, nuclear power was a matter of state importance and state secrecy. The Ministry of Medium Machine Building, which oversaw the entire nuclear industry, was one of the most closed structures in the USSR. Information about problems and accidents was classified. When, on September the 9th, 1982nd year, a serious accident occurred at the first unit of the same Chernobyl NPP, involving partial core destruction and the release of radioactivity. A very narrow circle of people learned about it. The general public, and most specialists at other nuclear power plants, simply did not know about the problem. This brings us to one of the key factors of the future catastrophe, the culture of safety, or rather, its absence. In the Western nuclear industry, after several serious incidents, a special philosophy was developed: safety first. Any, even potential threat must be eliminated, regardless of the cost. Personnel must be aware of all risks. Information about accidents and incidents must be accessible to all specialists to learn from others' mistakes. In the Soviet Union, the logic was different. The main thing was to fulfill the plan. The nuclear power plant must work, generate electricity, and supply industry. Downtime meant failure to fulfill the plan, a headache for the plant director and party bosses. Additional safety systems meant additional costs, increasing the project cost and extending construction time. And the plan required commissioning capacity quickly and cheaply. Plant personnel often did not receive full information about the risks. Safety instructions were written in a way that made them difficult to understand. The culture of not sticking your neck out, typical of the Soviet system, operated here too. If an engineer noticed a problem and raised the alarm, he risked being labeled a panic monger and bringing trouble upon the management. There were cases when safety systems were turned off so as not to interfere with certain work or experiments. Regulations were violated for the sake of not stopping the production of electricity. And all this happened against the backdrop of an ideology that asserted the superiority of Soviet science and technology. To admit that our reactors had design flaws meant admitting mistakes, and that was unacceptable. By the mid-80s, about 15 nuclear power plants with several dozen power units were operating in the USSR. This was a huge industry into which colossal resources had been invested and which provided a significant part of the electricity for the European part of the country. Nuclear power plants became the most important element of the energy system, without which the economy could not function normally. And it was this critical dependence, multiplied by the design flaws of the reactors and the weak safety culture, that created the perfect conditions for a catastrophe. All that was missing was a spark, a specific situation when all these factors converged at one point. And that point was the night of April the 25th to the 26th, 1986th year, at the 4th power unit of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Spring in Ukraine is the time when nature bursts into life. April the 26th was a Saturday. The May holidays were ahead, and the residents of Pripyat were making plans for the weekend. No one could have predicted that this night would divide their lives into before and after. At the 4th power unit of the Chernobyl NPP, preparations were underway for a planned reactor shutdown for maintenance. But before that, they decided to conduct an experiment that had been postponed for 1 year. The task seemed reasonable: to check whether the turbo generator, in coast-down mode, when it is still rotating by inertia after the steam supply is cut off, could provide enough electricity to operate the emergency cooling systems. This was an attempt to close a vulnerable spot in the station's safety. The experiment began in the afternoon on April the 25th. The reactor power began to be smoothly reduced. The plan was simple: lower the power to a certain level, perform the test, and then shut down the reactor for repair. But deviations from the program began almost immediately. Around 1 o'clock in the morning on the 26th of April, the reactor power dropped to a critically low level, only 30 megawatts instead of the planned 700. The automation system worked unexpectedly. The operators lost control of the process. The reactor found itself in an unstable state, precisely in that dangerous zone where the positive steam void coefficient of reactivity could play a cruel trick. The normal response in such a situation would be to stop the experiment, shut down the reactor, and figure out what went wrong. But the shift supervisor decided to continue. Perhaps the pressure of the plan played a role. The experiment had already been postponed several times, and it needed to be completed. Perhaps they did not fully understand the risks. Perhaps it was just overconfidence. We know what we are doing. Operators began manually raising the power by pulling out the control rods from the core. To do this, they violated a key safety rule. The reactor must have a certain minimum number of rods that ensure the ability to quickly stop the chain reaction. This rule was ignored. At 1 hour, 23 minutes, and 47 seconds, the emergency protection button, AZ5, was pressed. The rods began descending into the core to suppress the reaction. But something unforeseen happened. Due to the design features of the RBMK, which many operators didn't even know about, the reactor power did not drop in the first seconds after pressing AZ5, but sharply increased. The rods had graphite tips on their ends, and when they began to enter the core, these tips displaced the water and locally intensified the reaction. An uncontrolled chain reaction began. In fractions of a second, the reactor power surged to levels exceeding the nominal by tens, possibly hundreds of times. The immense heat instantly converted the water into steam. The pressure ruptured the fuel channels. The first explosion sounded, a steam explosion, which destroyed the reactor structures. A second explosion followed a few seconds later, possibly hydrogen or a secondary steam explosion. The 1,000-ton plate covering the reactor was torn off and stood almost vertically. The roof of the reactor building collapsed. A column of fire soared more than 1 kilometer into the sky. Operators in the central control room did not immediately realize the scale of what had happened. Instrument needles went off the charts. Communication with the reactor was lost, but it was difficult to believe that the 1,000-ton reactor had simply been destroyed. The first people who ran out to look saw a scene of apocalypse. The building destroyed, flames raging inside, and a strange glow in the air. Fire crews were summoned to the station. Firefighters from the unit located right at the station arrived first. Vladimir Pravik, Viktor Kibanok, and their comrades climbed onto the roof of the machine hall and began fighting the fire, unaware that they were in the epicenter of a radioactive hell. They saw glowing pieces of graphite scattered by the explosion, walked on them, and threw them off the roof with their hands. Dosimeters went off the charts, but the firefighters continued to work. By morning, the fire was localized, but many of these heroes had already received lethal doses of radiation. Meanwhile, the destroyed reactor continued to release radioactivity into the atmosphere. The core was ruptured, thousands of fuel elements were scattered, and the graphite stack was burning. Radioactive isotopes of iodine, cesium, strontium, and plutonium rose into the sky and were carried away by the wind. On the morning of April the 26th, it was sunny and warm in Pripyat. People walked in the streets, children played in the yards. No one knew anything. A strange smoke hung over the station, but which townspeople understood nuclear energy? Dosimeters of the military and scientists who began to gather at the station showed monstrous numbers, but the information remained classified. The first reports went to Moscow that night, but no one had the full picture. Plant Director Viktor Bryukhanov wrote in his first summary that the situation in the city of Pripyat is normal, the radiation level is controlled. This was not just a delusion, it was a reflection of the system in which bad news was sought to be suppressed, embellished, and presented in the best light. It wasn't until the evening of April the 26th that the Moscow leadership began to realize that a catastrophe of unprecedented scale had occurred. Mikhail Gorbachev, General Secretary of the Communist Party Central Committee, received contradictory reports. A government commission headed by Boris Sherbina flew to Pripyat. But even when the scale became clear, the initial reaction was an attempt to minimize disclosure. In the Soviet tradition, catastrophes were not publicized. The world community was unaware of it, but serious technological accidents occurred and were suppressed in the USSR. Only on April the 28th, when Swedish and Finnish radiation monitoring stations recorded a sharp increase in background levels and raised the alarm, did TASS release a brief message. An accident occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. One of the reactors was damaged. Measures are being taken to eliminate the consequences of the incident. The victims have been provided with the necessary assistance. A government commission has been established. This terse note gave no hint of the real scale. Accident, damage, words that could be applied to a broken machine tool in a factory. Western media, using satellite data and radiation measurements, were already trumpeting a catastrophe, while the Soviet Union remained silent. Only on May the 14th, almost 3 weeks after the accident, did Gorbachev deliver a televised address. He acknowledged the seriousness of the situation, spoke about the victims, and the measures taken to liquidate the consequences. But this belated admission could no longer correct the first impression. The authorities had hidden the truth. Meanwhile, an unprecedented evacuation took place in Pripyat on April the 27th. In one night, more than 1,200 buses were brought to the city. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the local radio announced, residents should gather essential items, documents, and a minimum of food. The evacuation was temporary, for 2 or 3 days. Take only the most necessary things. People did not understand that they were parting with their homes forever. In 4 hours, from 1400 hours to 1800 hours, 44,460 people were evacuated from Pripyat. Columns of buses stretched for kilometers. The city was deserted. Thus began the heroic and terrible work of the liquidators at the station. The burning graphite in the reactor needed to be extinguished. A decision was made to cover the reactor from above. Bags of sand, clay, lead, and boron were dropped from helicopters. Pilots flew over the burning hell, receiving huge doses, but continued their sorties. Radioactive water accumulated beneath the reactor, threatening to break into the groundwater. 3 volunteers, engineers Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bespalov, and Boris Baranov, descended into the flooded basements in diving suits and manually opened the valves, draining the water. They knew what they were doing and survived, although it bordered on a miracle. Thus began the cleanup, which would stretch on for years and involve hundreds of thousands of people. But already in the first days and hours after the explosion, it became clear something had happened that would change everything. Not just an accident at the station, but an event whose consequences would be felt for decades and which would undermine the very foundation of the Soviet system. When trying to assess the economic damage from Chernobyl, a strange feeling arises. The numbers become so enormous that they cease to be understandable. $200 billion, 300, 500. What does that mean for an ordinary person? Let's try to figure out what this catastrophe really cost. Let's start with the fact that a single official assessment still does not exist. Different sources cite figures ranging from $18 billion to $700 billion. Such a discrepancy is due not only to calculation methods but also to what is included in the damage. Only direct costs for liquidation, or the entire complex of consequences for decades to come. Ukraine, on whose territory the accident occurred, estimates its damage at approximately $180 billion. Belarus, which received about 70% of the radioactive fallout due to the wind direction, names a figure of $235 billion. This is 32 annual budgets of the Republic for 1985th year. Russia has not published official total estimates, but extensive territories of the Bryansk, Kaluga, Tula, and other regions were affected. A reference from the Soviet Ministry of Finance dated July the 16th, 1991st year, one of the last documents of the dying USSR, indicated the costs of liquidating the consequences for the period from 1986th to 1990th years. Over these first 5 years alone, more than 200 billion rubles were spent in 1990th year prices. For perspective, the entire annual budget of the USSR in the mid-80s was about 400 billion rubles. Let's try to break down this damage into specific expenditure items to understand where the money went. The first is the liquidation of the accident itself. In the first weeks and months, it was a real battle with an invisible enemy. More than 600,000 people received the status of liquidators, people who participated in the work to eliminate the consequences. Military personnel, firefighters, engineers, miners, builders, doctors. People were brought from all over the Union. Everyone had to be paid a salary, and an increased one at that, providing food, housing, and specialized clothing. Equipment worked in monstrous conditions. Radiation disabled electronics, destroyed rubber seals, and rendered machines unusable after several hours of work. Hundreds of pieces of equipment were simply buried in special burial grounds. Decontaminating them was impossible or impractical. Helicopters that dropped sand and lead into the reactor, more than 4,000 sorties in the first 10 days, required constant maintenance. Colossal volumes of materials were needed to create barriers around the station. 5,000 tons of boron, 2,400 tons of lead, 1,800 tons of sand and clay were dropped into the reactor. A concrete slab was built under the reactor to protect groundwater. Dams were erected on the Pripyat River. All this, millions of tons of construction materials, thousands of man-hours of labor. A separate line of expenditure was the construction of the sarcophagus over the destroyed fourth unit. This was an unprecedented engineering project. It was necessary to cover the radioactive ruins with a structure made of concrete and metal. Work was carried out under conditions of severe irradiation, with a strict time limit for staying at the site. People worked in shifts for a few minutes. By the end of 1986th year, the sarcophagus was ready. A grandiose structure the height of a 20-story building. But it turned out that this sarcophagus was not eternal. Problems began after just a few years. The structure was deteriorating, cracks were appearing, threatening a new release of radioactivity. The construction of a new protective structure was required, an arch that was supposed to cover the old sarcophagus. This project cost €1.5 billion, and the money was raised by the international community because post-Soviet countries no longer had such funds. Now about the territories. The exclusion zone with a radius of 30 kilometers around the station. That is about 2,500 square kilometers of land withdrawn from economic use forever or for centuries. Imagine, a territory larger than Moscow simply ceased to exist for the economy. Arable land, forests, rivers, mineral deposits, all this was lost. But radioactive contamination did not stop at the border of the 30-kilometer zone. Significant territories of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia were contaminated to varying degrees. About 340 industrial enterprises in the affected territories ceased operation or incurred huge losses. Agriculture, traditionally a strength of these regions, suffered a crushing blow. Milk, meat, grain, and vegetables from contaminated territories became unsuitable for consumption. Evacuation and resettlement of people, that is a separate story with colossal costs. The first wave, 115,000 people from the 30-kilometer zone in the first days after the accident. But as the scale of the contamination became clear, resettlement continued for years. In the end, more than 350,000 people left their homes. Each family needed to be provided with new housing. Entire settlements and micro-districts were urgently built in other regions. Compensation was paid for abandoned property, houses, household items, personal belongings. Benefits and allowances were provided. People lost not only their homes but also their jobs, their familiar way of life, and ties to the place where they grew up. This cannot be assessed in money, but the state tried to compensate somehow. Medical expenses were felt immediately and continue to this day. In the first months, about 134 people with acute radiation sickness were admitted to specialized clinic number 6 in Moscow. 28 of them died in the first weeks and months. But that is only the tip of the iceberg. Hundreds of thousands of liquidators received various doses of radiation. Millions of people lived in contaminated territories. The need arose for a long-term medical monitoring system, specialized dispensaries, regular examinations, treatment of radiation-related diseases. All this required funding for decades to come. Belarus still spends about 6% of its annual budget on programs related to the consequences of Chernobyl. Energy losses also proved colossal. Before the accident, the Chernobyl NPP provided 10% of the electricity of the Ukrainian SSR. After the explosion, the fourth unit was destroyed. The third unit was shut down a few days later. The first and second continued to operate, but in 1991st year, they were also shut down. The station was completely decommissioned only in 2000 year. These are gigawatts of lost capacity that had to be compensated by building other stations or purchasing electricity. But the most terrible blow to the USSR's nuclear energy happened not at the Chernobyl station. projects for the construction of new nuclear power plants were frozen or canceled across the country. The Crimean NPP, 80% unfinished, billions of rubles invested, was mothballed. Bashkir NPP, the same story. Gorky, Tatar, Far Eastern, more than a dozen projects in total, into which huge sums had already been invested. The grandiose program for the development of nuclear energy, upon which the Soviet Union relied, was virtually curtailed. It was planned that by the end of the century, nuclear power plants would provide up to 30% of the country's electricity. Instead, the share of nuclear generation stalled at the level of 10 to 12%. They had to return to thermal power plants, burn more gas, coal, and fuel oil, more expensive and less efficient energy sources. The export of nuclear technologies, which was a source of pride and foreign currency, collapsed. Eastern European countries revised their programs for building Soviet nuclear power plants. Poland abandoned an already started project. The reputation of the Soviet nuclear school was undermined. But perhaps the greatest economic loss was what we cannot accurately calculate: lost opportunities, under-received products, frozen investments, outflow of skilled personnel, psychological shock that paralyzed the development of entire regions. When the economy was already stalling, Chernobyl became the burden that finally pinned it to the ground. And all this, only direct, measurable losses. Systemic consequences lay ahead, which hit the entire economy of the Soviet Union, and perhaps became one of the reasons for its collapse. The direct losses from Chernobyl are the visible part of the iceberg, but the real catastrophe unfolded deeper, in the very body of the Soviet economy. The accident launched a chain reaction of problems that piled up one on top of the other, creating a systemic crisis. Let's start with energy, the circulatory system of any industrial economy. After the accident, the Soviet leadership faced a terrible choice. On the one hand, they could not stop all RBMK-type reactors. That would paralyze the energy system of the European part of the country. On the other hand, continuing to operate reactors with the same design flaws was madness. They settled on a compromise. The reactors continued to operate, but with colossal investments in improving safety. Additional protection systems were installed at every station, control rods were redesigned, and control systems were improved. This required huge amounts of money and time. Every reactor shut down for modernization meant lost electricity, industry without energy, and under-received production. Simultaneously, the construction of new nuclear power plants was frozen or closed. The Crimean nuclear power plant, on which billions had already been spent and which was 80% complete, stopped. Bashkir, Tatar, Gorky, dozens of projects across the Union halted. These were not just frozen funds. They were lost future capacities that were supposed to come online in the early 90s and give the country cheap energy. Instead of nuclear power plants, they had to urgently increase the capacity of thermal power plants, build new coal and gas power plants, modernize old ones. But this is a completely different economy. Thermal generation is more expensive than nuclear. Fuel must be constantly supplied, and payment made for its extraction and transportation. Coal had to be transported by trains for thousands of kilometers. Gas required pipeline construction. Fuel oil, the dirtiest and least efficient fuel, also returned to the energy balance. Imagine, you planned that by the 90s, nuclear power plants would provide 1/3 of the country's total electricity at minimal cost. And suddenly, stop. The program was curtailed. They had to burn more coal and gas, which could have been exported for foreign currency. It was precisely in those years when foreign currency was needed more than ever. Oil prices dropped from $28 to $10 per barrel in 1986 year, and the USSR budget was bursting at the seams. This energy breakdown hit the industry of Ukraine and Belarus, the regions most affected by radiation, the hardest. The Ukrainian SSR was the industrial giant of the Union. Metallurgy, machine building, chemical industry, all this required colossal energy consumption. The Chernobyl NPP provided 10% of the Republic's electricity. The loss of this capacity created a deficit that had to be closed by restrictions on enterprises, rolling blackouts, and purchasing energy from neighboring republics. Belarus suffered an even heavier blow. About 70% of the radioactive fallout fell on Belarusian land. The wind carried the cloud north. Entire regions were affected by contamination. Gomel and Mogilev suffered especially heavily. About 340 industrial enterprises were in the contamination zone. Many of them had to be closed completely. Others operated with huge restrictions. Additional radiation protection measures were needed for workers, special conditions for storage and transportation of products, and constant radiation control. All this increased the cost price, making the products less competitive. 54 collective farms and state farms were liquidated, and 9 processing plants were closed. 2,500 square kilometers of agricultural land were withdrawn from agricultural use. In a country where every hectare of arable land was accounted for, this meant a huge loss of the food base. But it was not just about the land withdrawn from use. Much larger territories remained formally accessible but became problematic. Radioactive cesium-137, with a half-life of 30 years, accumulated in the soil. Plants absorb it, animals receive it through fodder, and eventually it ends up in milk, meat, and grain. In Belarus, more than half of the forest areas of the Gomel region and more than 1/3 of the Mogilev region were contaminated. Timber harvesting in highly contaminated areas completely ceased. In a country where forest is a major export commodity and a source of raw materials for woodworking, this was a serious blow to the economy. Mineral deposits were located in the contamination zone. About half of the industrial reserves of molding sands, 91% of glass sands, a significant portion of chalk, clays, and building stone. All this became inaccessible or difficult to access. The development of deposits required special protection measures. The export and use of raw materials required constant control. Agriculture in the central regions of Russia, Bryansk, Tula, Kaluga, was also affected. Radioactive spots fell on fertile Chernozyms. Even decades later, contamination levels exceeded safety standards. The lands continued to be used, but with restrictions and under constant control. Products required inspection. Some crops could not be grown at all. The USSR was already facing food problems in the late 80s. Grain purchases abroad grew year by year. Meat, milk, and vegetables were in deficit. And suddenly, the loss of a significant part of productive agricultural land in the most developed territories. This exacerbated the food crisis, forcing more foreign currency to be spent on imports. Reputational losses for Soviet industry proved colossal. Before Chernobyl, the USSR was one of the leaders in nuclear energy. Soviet reactors were built in Eastern Europe, in Finland, and projects were planned in other countries. Nuclear technologies were a source of pride and export revenue. After the accident, everything changed overnight. Soviet technologies began to be perceived as dangerous and unreliable. Poland refused to build a nuclear power plant with Soviet reactors. Protests against existing stations began in other Eastern European countries. The international community demanded the closure of dangerous Soviet reactors. The export of nuclear technologies virtually ceased. But the damage to reputation went beyond the nuclear sector. Chernobyl became a symbol of the imperfection of all Soviet industry. If such a thing could happen at a strategically important facility, surrounded by maximum control measures, what could be said about other sectors? This undermined confidence in Soviet products on world markets. Massive resource shifts began within the country. Huge funds that should have gone to industrial development, equipment modernization, and the introduction of new technologies were now directed toward eliminating the consequences of the catastrophe. The budget was bursting at the seams, investments in development fell, enterprises were underfunded for upgrades, lagging further and further technologically. There was also something that cannot be measured in figures, but which may be even more important than economic statistics: the psychological shock. Nuclear energy ceased to be a prestigious industry. Young specialists did not want to go work at nuclear power plants. The personnel training system was broken. Those who worked in the nuclear industry found themselves under the weight of public condemnation. Instead of pride in working at the forefront of science, they felt guilty for the catastrophe. More broadly, society lost faith in the Soviet system. If the authorities could not prevent such a catastrophe, if they suppressed the truth, endangering millions of people, if they were unable to effectively deal with the consequences, why should they be trusted at all? This crisis of trust became perhaps the main systemic consequence of Chernobyl. Labor productivity in enterprises in contaminated regions fell. People were afraid of radiation, many wanted to leave, and skilled personnel left the region. Recruiting new workers became a problem. Who wants to move to places from which others are being evacuated? Enterprises experienced a shortage of labor, especially skilled labor. And all this happened against the backdrop of a general economic crisis. 1986th year, the collapse of oil prices. The budget lost about 40 billion rubles in revenue over 3 years. The war in Afghanistan continued to drain resources. Gorbachev's perestroika destroyed the familiar planning mechanisms without creating new effective ones. The economy was spiraling down. Chernobyl was not the cause of all these problems, but it became the additional burden that broke the back of the already weakened system. It diverted colossal resources at a moment when every ruble was critically important. It undermined the prestige of a key industry upon which energy development plans depended. It destroyed public trust in the authorities precisely when that trust was necessary for reforms. Economists argue, can Chernobyl be considered one of the causes of the collapse of the USSR? There is no direct link, of course, but indirectly, absolutely. The accident intensified all existing crisis trends, added new problems, and weakened the already shaky structure of the Soviet economy. It was not the only nail in the coffin of the Union, but one of the heaviest. If the economic losses from Chernobyl can at least be attempted to be calculated, the political consequences are impossible to measure. But it is they, perhaps, that proved the most devastating for the Soviet system. The accident became the point after which relations between the authorities and society changed forever. Let's start with the main blow, the suppression of information. On the night of April the 26th, a catastrophe of unprecedented scale occurred. A radioactive cloud crept over Europe, and in the Soviet Union, silence. Not a word in the newspapers, not a line in the news. Residents of Pripyat walked in the streets, children played in the yards, people went to work, and no one knew they were in mortal danger. April the 27th, not a word. The 28th, finally, after Swedish stations recorded radiation and raised the alarm, TASS issued a terse note about an accident. That was all. No details, no explanations. The country was in the dark, and the government was silent. This was the classic Soviet reaction to catastrophes, to suppress, hide, and minimize. They always acted this way. The explosion at the Mayak plant in 57th year, dozens of other accidents and incidents. The Soviet system did not know how to admit mistakes. Any incident was interpreted as a blow to prestige, as compromising material that the enemy could use. But times had changed. In February 1986th year, just 2 months before Chernobyl, at the 27th Congress of the Communist Party, Mikhail Gorbachev proclaimed the course toward glasnost: openness. Society should know the truth. The government should be open. Only this way could perestroika, restructuring, be carried out. So said the General Secretary. And here was the first serious test of this policy, and a failure. Only on May the 14th, 18 days after the accident, did Gorbachev deliver a televised address. He admitted the seriousness of the situation, spoke about the victims and the heroism of the liquidators, and explained the scale of the work. But it was too late. The first impression had already been formed. The authorities had hidden the truth. Gorbachev himself later acknowledged that Chernobyl became a turning point for Glasnost. He wrote, "This tragedy gave impetus for Glasnost as a party policy to spread the ideas of perestroika to become real freedom of speech. After Chernobyl, party instances could no longer prohibit the media from writing about problems. But this new freedom of speech turned against the authorities themselves. Journalists began to dig deeper. It turned out that the flaws of the RBMK reactors were known long before the catastrophe, that there were warnings that were ignored, that the accident at the first unit of the Chernobyl NPP in 82nd year was classified, that the culture of safety was sacrificed for the sake of fulfilling the plan. Every such exposure struck a blow to the authority of the system. If the authorities knew about the risks and did nothing, then they were irresponsible. If they hid information about accidents, then they were dishonest. If they placed the plan above the safety of people, then they were inhuman. Distrust of the authorities began to grow like a snowball. People asked questions. If they lied to us about Chernobyl, what else are they lying about? If they could not ensure the safety of a nuclear power plant, what about other spheres? If, at a critical moment, they thought more about prestige than about people's lives, can such authorities be trusted at all? Chernobyl became a catalyst for the birth of civil society in the USSR. Before this, any independent activity was suppressed. After Chernobyl, mass public movements appeared for the first time, which the authorities could not simply ban. The first wave was environmental movements. They existed before. Moscow State University biology students formed nature conservation detachments in the 60s. There were protests against diverting Siberian rivers and the fight to save Lake Baikal. But this was fragmented activity that the authorities kept under control. After Chernobyl, the environmental movement exploded. Dozens of organizations appeared across the Union. Greens gained a voice. Their opinion became important. Eco-activists began to take posts in government, influencing decisions. The topic of ecology became part of the political agenda. And very quickly, environmental protests turned into political ones. In Belarus, the Chernobyl Shliak, Chernobyl Way movement emerged. Annual marches on the anniversary of the catastrophe. Formally, these were mournful processions in memory of the victims. But very soon they became a platform for expressing political demands. The first Chernobyl Shliak took place in October 1989th year, from the square near the Palace of Sports to the Academy of Sciences. It was organized by the newly created Belarusian People's Front. About 30,000 people gathered. They demanded full information about the scale of contamination, the return of benefits to the affected, and the cessation of using contaminated lands. But the main thing was that for the first time, so many people publicly spoke out against the authorities' actions, and the authorities did not dare to disperse this procession. Chernobyl gave legitimacy to the protest. How could one forbid people from demanding the truth about radiation and protection from danger? That would have been too cynical even for the Soviet system. The Chernobyl Shliak became one of the symbols of the awakening of the Belarusian national movement. The topic of Chernobyl intertwined with the topic of national identity. Belarus received 70% of the radioactive fallout, but decisions were made in Moscow. Belarusians were not asked whether to evacuate territories or continue to use them. They were silent about the real scale of contamination so as not to cause panic. This fueled nationalism. Moscow manages our land, our lives, without even deeming it necessary to ask us. Similar sentiments grew in Ukraine. The Chernobyl station was on Ukrainian land. Ukraine suffered the most, but all key decisions were made in the Kremlin. Anti-nuclear protests swept across the entire Union. In Armenia, a powerful movement against the Metsamor NPP unfolded in 87th through 89th years. After the Spytak earthquake, people feared that a nuclear power plant in a seismically active zone was a ticking time bomb. The protests were so strong that the station was shut down in 1989th. In Russia, protests were directed against the construction of new nuclear power plants. Bashkir, Tatar, Gorky, Crimean. Local residents opposed all these projects, and the authorities retreated, freezing construction. This was unimaginable in the pre-perestroika era, citizens protesting against a state program and winning. Chernobyl became a symbol of the collapse of the Soviet system. The catastrophe exposed all its vices: the cult of secrecy, disregard for human life, inability to admit mistakes, bureaucratic sluggishness, technological backwardness. Everything that was previously talked about in whispers was now visible to the naked eye. The intelligentsia, which had previously cautiously criticized individual shortcomings while maintaining overall loyalty to the system, now began to radicalize. Writers, journalists, scientists openly posed the question, is this system viable at all? Maybe fundamental changes are needed, not cosmetic reforms. International isolation added its note to this symphony of destruction. The prestige of the USSR, already shaken after 10 years of war in Afghanistan, received a new blow. Western media painted a picture of an irresponsible superpower that could not control its nuclear power plants and endangered all of Europe. The Soviet leadership tried to push back, accusing the West of fueling panic and anti-Soviet propaganda. But the facts were stubborn. The radioactive cloud did cover half of Europe. The contamination was indeed colossal. There were indeed many victims, and the authorities did indeed try to hide it all. International confidence in Soviet assurances of safety was undermined. This complicated arms control negotiations. How could one believe data on the nuclear arsenal of a country that could not even honestly report an accident at a peaceful nuclear power plant? This undermined trade relations. European countries refused to import Soviet products, fearing radiation. The most frightening thing for the Soviet system was that Chernobyl could not be blamed on the machinations of enemies or individual saboteurs. It was a systemic failure. The reactors were designed by the best Soviet engineers. The stations were built according to state standards. Operators were qualified specialists. Control was exercised by party and state bodies. And all this did not help prevent the catastrophe. Therefore, the problem lies in the system itself, in its logic, where the plan is more important than safety, in its culture, where criticism is perceived as sedition, in its inflexibility, which does not allow for quick response to new challenges, in its closed nature, which creates an information vacuum. Chernobyl left no doubt. Such a system is non-viable, and a chain reaction of collapse began, much more destructive than the one that occurred in the reactor of the fourth unit. Now let's try to look into that parallel reality where the night of April the 26th, 1986th year passed peacefully. The experiment on the fourth unit was successfully completed, the operators recorded the results, and the reactor was shut down for planned repairs. In the morning, people in Pripyat woke up, children went to school, factories started working. An ordinary day in a successful Soviet city. What would have changed in the fate of the Soviet Union? Could it have survived the 90s and been preserved until today? Or was the collapse inevitable, and Chernobyl merely accelerated the inevitable? Let's try to figure out both scenarios. The first scenario is optimistic. Let's imagine that without Chernobyl, the USSR could have carried out smoother reforms and avoided catastrophic collapse. Let's start with the most obvious, resource savings. More than 200 billion rubles spent on liquidating the consequences in the first 5 years alone remain in the budget. This is a colossal sum. With this money, tens of thousands of enterprises could have been modernized, new technologies introduced, and the living standards of the population raised. The nuclear energy program continues to develop according to plan. By the mid-90s, the Crimean, Bashkir, Tatar, and Gorky nuclear power plants are commissioned. The share of nuclear generation reaches the planned 30%. This is cheap, clean energy that reduces dependence on organic fuel. Gas and oil, which in our reality had to be burned at thermal power plants to compensate for the unfinished nuclear power plants, go for export. Additional foreign currency flows into the budget. Yes, oil prices in 86th through 88th years are low, but by the beginning of the 90s, they recover. Every extra million tons of exported oil means millions of dollars in the treasury. The industry of Ukraine and Belarus retains its potential. Dozens of enterprises that, in our reality, closed or operated with restrictions due to radiation, continue to produce goods. Agriculture does not lose fertile land. 2,500 square kilometers of arable land remain in use. Hundreds of thousands of people do not lose their homes, jobs, or familiar life. There is no need to build new settlements for resettled people, pay compensation, or maintain an extensive medical observation system. The economy of the republics does not bear this burden. But the main thing is that a powerful environmental movement does not emerge as a political opposition. Yes, environmental problems exist even without Chernobyl. Pollution of rivers, deforestation, soil salinization. But these are local issues that the authorities can keep under control. There is no unifying tragedy that mobilizes people across the country. Gorbachev's glasnost develops slower and more cautiously. There is no shock caused by the suppression of information about Chernobyl. The authorities are not discredited by such an obvious lie. They have more time and space for maneuver. Criticism remains within the bounds of constructive, not escalating into systemic denial. National movements in the republics do not receive such a powerful catalyst. In Belarus, there is no Chernobyl Shliak, annual multi-thousand protests that become a platform for political mobilization. In Ukraine, there are fewer reasons to accuse Moscow of neglecting Ukrainian lives. The prestige of Soviet science and technology is not undermined so severely. The USSR remains one of the leaders in nuclear energy. Contracts for the construction of nuclear power plants abroad continue to bring in foreign currency. The country's international reputation does not receive such a blow. In this scenario, the Soviet Union gets a chance to carry out a gradual transformation. Economic reforms proceed slower, but social upheaval is also less. Perhaps by the beginning of the 2000s, the USSR evolves into something like a confederation of republics with a market economy, following the Chinese path, but with greater democratization. Sounds tempting, doesn't it? But there is also a second scenario, pessimistic. In it, Chernobyl was just one of many factors, and without it, the collapse was still inevitable. Let's honestly look at the state of the USSR by the mid-80s. The economy has been stalling for a decade and a half. Growth rates fall with every 5-year plan. The technological gap with the West is growing. The computer revolution passes by. Soviet electronics are hopelessly behind. The war in Afghanistan has been going on for 6 years and has turned into a bleeding wound. Zinc coffins return home annually. The costs of the war are enormous, with no result. Society is tired. Soldiers are demoralized. International reputation is undermined. The USSR became as much of an aggressor as the USA in Vietnam. Oil prices collapsed. In the early 80s, a barrel cost about $35. By 86th year, it was less than 10. For an economy critically dependent on oil revenues, this is a catastrophe. Foreign currency earnings were cut by more than 3 times. The budget was bursting at the seams. Commodity shortages reached a critical point. Shelves were empty in stores. Lines for sausage, meat, and sugar became the norm. People collected coupons, stood overnight to buy essentials. Living standards were falling. Irritation and discontent were growing. The planned economy showed its inefficiency. Enterprises produced what the plan required, not what people needed. Warehouses were full of unclaimed products, but stores were empty. Innovations were crushed by bureaucracy. Every innovation required approval at dozens of levels. Initiative was not encouraged but punished. Corruption penetrated every pore of the system. Party bosses lived in luxury, had access to special distributors, special polyclinics, and special dachas. Ordinary people saw this and understood. Equality is a myth. Some are more equal than others, as Orwell wrote. The national questions smoldered throughout the Union. In the Baltics, they had not forgotten the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and remembered independence. In the Caucasus, ancient national contradictions slept under a thin layer of Soviet ideology. In Central Asia, Islamic self-awareness was growing. In Ukraine, the national movement was strengthening. The communist ideology had run out of steam. Few seriously believed in the imminent construction of communism. The bright future had been promised for 70 years, but stores were empty. Young people listened to Western music, wore jeans, and dreamed of life as seen in Western films. The ideological core of the system was destroyed. The Cold War demanded huge expenses. Parity with the USA in armaments cost roughly 1/3 of the entire budget. Every new American missile system required the creation of a Soviet analog. The arms race drained resources that could have gone to improving living standards. In this context, Chernobyl was just one of the blows the system received. Yes, a strong blow. Yes, painful. But if it hadn't happened, there would have been another. Maybe the economic crisis would have escalated sooner. Maybe inter-ethnic conflicts would have flared up elsewhere. Maybe a military conflict on the borders. Historian Olesia Drokhanova writes in her work, The Chernobyl Trace in the Collapse of the USSR. Chernobyl did not become the primary cause of the collapse of the USSR, although its tragic radioactive trace remained part of the history of the USSR during the period of collapse. The catastrophe accelerated the processes but did not initiate them. Gorbachev himself said, the Chernobyl catastrophe was perhaps the real reason for the collapse of the Soviet Union 5 years later. But this is the assessment of a participant in the events who may be exaggerating the role of a single factor to explain the collapse of the system he was trying to reform. The Economist magazine wrote on the 30th anniversary of the catastrophe, Chernobyl became the impetus for the collapse of the Soviet Union, but an impetus, not a cause. The cart was already rolling downhill. Chernobyl just pushed it harder. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Without Chernobyl, the collapse might have happened later, not in 91, but say in 95 or 98. The process might have been less painful, more manageable. Some form of union of republics might have been preserved, not the USSR in the old form, but not complete disintegration either. But the fundamental problems would not have gone away. The inefficiency of the planned economy is not solved by additional billions in the budget. It is a systemic flaw. National contradictions do not disappear because there is no specific reason for indignation. They accumulated for decades. Technological backwardness is not quickly eliminated. It is the result of the entire organization of science and production. China managed to carry out market reforms while maintaining the power of the Communist Party. But there were different conditions there: a mono-ethnic state, a tradition of strong centralized power, less militarization of the economy, and a readiness for harsh measures to suppress dissent. The USSR was a multinational empire with huge military expenditures and a tradition of ideological control that was difficult to combine with a market economy. So what? Did Chernobyl kill the USSR or just accelerate the agony of the dying? Perhaps the correct answer is both. The system was mortally ill but could have lasted for years. Chernobyl became the infection that turned a chronic illness into an acute phase. Without it, perhaps there would have been a chance for softer transformation. With it, there were almost no chances left. History does not know the subjunctive mood, but we can reflect on the turning points. The night of April the 26th, 1986th year, was one such turning point, and fate chose the path of catastrophe. The most agonizing question asked by everyone who studies Chernobyl is, could it have been avoided? Was the accident an inevitable technical regularity or a chain of coincidences in which any link could have been broken? Let's start with the technical side. RBMK reactors had design flaws that specialists knew about long before the catastrophe. The positive steam void coefficient of reactivity at low power turned the reactor into an unstable system. Under certain operating modes, it could spiral into an uncontrolled surge in seconds. The control rods of the emergency protection system had graphite tips. This was an oversight by the designers. When the rods were introduced into the core, the reactivity did not drop but increased in the first seconds. This is exactly what happened that fateful night. When the operators pressed the AZ5 button, they did not stop the reaction but accelerated it. The chief designer of the RBMK itself, academician Nikolai Dolezhal, opposed placing such reactors in the densely populated European part of the country. He understood the risks, but his opinion was not decisive. Politics and economics stood behind the decisions. In September 1984th year, a year and a half before the catastrophe, a meeting on RBMK safety was held under the leadership of Yuri Filomontsev. Many of the reactor's flaws were revealed there. A protocol was drawn up with measures for improvement. The management of the Chernobyl NPP was informed. But until April 86th year, the main part of these measures was never implemented. 5 months before the catastrophe, an inspector from the State Committee for Supervision of Safe Conduct of Work in Nuclear Power sent a report to Moscow about serious violations at the CHNPP. The report was ignored. This was not an accident. It was a system in which unpleasant signals from below were suppressed at every level of the hierarchy. Valery Legasov, the academician who headed the Soviet group of scientists for the liquidation of the accident consequences, later wrote about a fundamental design error. Protections were accessible to personnel. Operators could physically disable safety systems. Academician Anatoly Alexandrov aptly noted, the only thing missing there was protection against a fool who decided to turn off the protection for the sake of his experiment. This brings us to organizational factors. Western reactors were designed with the principle of foolproof, as the English say. Critical safety systems must be inaccessible for personnel to disable. Even if an operator wants to, he physically cannot disable key protections. In the USSR, the logic was different. They trusted the person, the trained specialist. It was believed that the Soviet engineer was disciplined, educated, and understood responsibility. Giving him access to management meant showing trust. Prohibiting something meant doubting his competence. But this ran into another feature of the system, the culture of fulfilling the plan at any cost. The experiment on the 4th unit had been postponed for 1 year. Every time reasons were found to postpone. Either the conditions were unsuitable or the equipment was not ready. Management pressured them. It needed to be finished, needed to be reported. A plan is a plan. That night, the operators found themselves trapped between technical safety requirements and administrative pressure. The reactor power dropped to a critically low level, 30 megawatts. According to all the rules, the experiment should have been stopped, the reactor shut down, and the issue resolved. But that meant failing to complete the task again, explaining themselves to the superiors again, and getting reprimanded again. They decided to continue. To raise the power, they began to extract control rods, violating the rule about the minimum operational reactivity margin. To carry out the experiment, they disabled the emergency cooling system. One violation compounded another, creating perfect conditions for a catastrophe. But they could have said no. They could have refused to conduct the experiment under dangerous conditions. They could have called the higher management and reported the risks. Theoretically, Yes, practically very difficult. In Soviet culture, initiative from below was not encouraged, especially if it contradicted instructions from above. A person who raises the alarm risks being labeled a panic monger, an overcautious person disrupting the plan. This could cost a career. It was simpler to hope that everything would be fine, as it had been hundreds of times before. Shortcomings in personnel training exacerbated the situation. Operators were not fully informed about all the design features of the RBMK. The fact that the graphite tips of the rods could cause a surge in reactivity under certain conditions was not reflected in the instructions. Many subtleties of reactor physics remained known only to a narrow circle of designer specialists. This was a policy of secrecy taken to the point of absurdity. Information about reactor flaws, accidents at other stations, and dangerous operating modes, all this was classified. The accident at the first unit of the CHNPP in 82nd year was not brought to the attention of the operators of other units at the same station. How can one learn from mistakes if they cannot be discussed? Saving money on safety systems was another factor. RBMK reactors were designed to be cheap and quick to build. This was their main advantage over Western counterparts. But cheapness was achieved in part by simplifying safety systems. There was no powerful containment, a sealed shell that would have contained radioactive substances in the event of an accident. At Western stations, reactors were placed in massive concrete buildings with multi-meter walls, capable of withstanding even the crash of an airplane. In Chernobyl, the reactor had an ordinary roof of an industrial building. When the explosion occurred, radioactive substances burst out without any barriers. Comparison with Western standards shows the difference in approaches. After the accident at the American 3 Mile Island station in 1979th year, where a partial core meltdown occurred, the USA radically revised safety requirements. They created the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations, INPO, an independent organization dealing with safety issues. Personnel training was intensified. A strict safety culture was introduced, where any worker could stop operations if they saw a threat. In the USSR, after the accident in 82nd year at the same CHNPP, no systemic changes followed. They suppressed the information, classified it, and continued working as if nothing had happened. The culture of suppressing problems proved stronger than common sense. So, could the catastrophe have been prevented? Yes, on dozens of levels. If designers had corrected the known flaws of the RBMK, if such reactors had not been built in densely populated regions, if the recommendations of the 84th year meeting had been implemented, if the inspector's report 5 months before the accident had been heeded, if safety systems had been inaccessible for personnel to disable, if a culture of safety had prevailed over a culture of plan fulfillment, if operators had been fully informed about the risks, if someone had said stop that night. Any of these turning points could have changed the outcome, but all of them together pointed in one direction, toward catastrophe. It was not a chain of coincidences, but a systemic inevitability. The accident was waiting for its hour, and if it hadn't happened in Chernobyl in 86th year, it would have happened elsewhere at another time. The lessons of Chernobyl for the global nuclear industry proved painful but important. The International Atomic Energy Agency developed new safety standards. The Convention on Nuclear Safety was created. The principle of defense in depth, several independent levels of safety, each of which can prevent an accident, was introduced. Modern reactors are designed with passive safety systems that work even without electricity, using the laws of physics, convection, gravity. New generation Russian reactors have a melt trap, a special structure that, in the event of core destruction, will collect and cool the molten fuel, preventing it from escaping outside. The culture of safety has become the main priority. Any nuclear power plant employee has the right and obligation to stop operations if they see a threat. Information about incidents and accidents is disseminated openly so that everyone can learn from mistakes. Regular drills, inspections, and international safety assessment missions, all this has become the norm. But perhaps the main lesson of Chernobyl is about the price of secrecy and closed nature. Nuclear energy requires maximum openness, information exchange, a willingness to admit problems, and to learn from mistakes. Suppressing information for the sake of prestige, secrecy for the sake of secrecy, pressure of the plan for the sake of targets, all this is mortally dangerous when it comes to nuclear energy. Chernobyl was preventable, but this required a different system of values, a different culture, a different approach to safety. The catastrophe happened not because the technologies were imperfect. Technologies are always imperfect. It happened because the system placed the plan above people, prestige above truth, targets above safety. And this was a verdict not only on nuclear energy, but on the entire Soviet model. We have come a long way, from that April night in 1986th year through economic calculations, political upheavals, and alternative scenarios. Now it is time to return to the question we started with. Was Chernobyl that black swan, an unpredictable event that overturned history, or was it an inevitability that people simply didn't want to see? Let's recall Taleb's 3 signs of a black swan: rarity, massive impact, and retrospective predictability. The first 2 are clear. A catastrophe of this scale at a nuclear power plant occurred for the first time in history. The consequences truly changed the world, from the collapse of a superpower to the revision of the entire nuclear safety system. But the third sign, that is where the difficulties begin. A black swan should seem predictable only after it has happened. But with Chernobyl, it is different. All the signs of a catastrophe were present beforehand. Design flaws were known. Warnings from specialists were ignored. The accident at the same first unit was classified. The culture of safety was sacrificed for the plan. So Chernobyl is more like a gray rhino. As predictable yet ignored threats are called. Everyone knew about the problem but hoped they would get lucky. They weren't. But for the Soviet Union, Chernobyl played the role of a black swan, an unpredictable push that launched a chain reaction of collapse. No one could have predicted that an accident at one nuclear power plant would become a catalyst for political processes of such a scale. It was a cumulative effect. The blow hit a system that was already weakened by dozens of other problems. Imagine a building with cracks in the foundation, rotting beams, and crumbling plaster. It might stand for years, slowly deteriorating. But one strong blow, an earthquake, a hurricane, and it collapses. Chernobyl was such a blow to the USSR. Economically, the Soviet Union could perhaps have survived the 90s without Chernobyl. The 200+ billion rubles remaining in the budget, the additional capacity of nuclear power plants, the preserved industrial potential of the republics, all this would have provided more room for maneuver. Reforms could have proceeded slower without such a shock, but the fundamental problems would not have disappeared. The inefficiency of the planned economy, technological backwardness, commodity shortages, falling oil prices, the war in Afghanistan, this entire complex of crises was pressing on the system. Chernobyl intensified the pressure but did not create it. Politically, the damage proved perhaps even more devastating than the economic. The suppression of information about the catastrophe destroyed trust in the authorities precisely when Gorbachev was proclaiming glasnost. This was a stab in the back of his own policy. How can one trust authorities who choose lies at a critical moment? The crisis of trust gave rise to a wave of public activity, environmental movements, national protests, demands for truth and reforms. Without Chernobyl, this wave might have risen later and weaker. The authorities would have had more time to adapt, to find answers. The historical paradox of Chernobyl is that the tragedy revealed the truth. For decades, the Soviet system concealed its failures, suppressed information about accidents, and repressed critics. Chernobyl was too big to hide. A radioactive cloud over Europe cannot be declared Western propaganda. The evacuation of hundreds of thousands of people cannot be concealed. The catastrophe forced the truth to be spoken, and the truth turned out to be terrible. Systemic flaws, incompetence, neglect of safety, suppression of problems. This truth destroyed the foundations of Soviet ideology, the myth of the superiority of socialism, of the party's care for the people, of scientific and technical progress. The legacy of Chernobyl is complex and layered. For hundreds of thousands of liquidators, it is heroism and sacrifice, which they often paid for with their health and lives. More than 60,000 of them are no longer with us. For millions of residents of the contaminated territories, it is a trauma they have lived with for decades. But there is another legacy, the lessons humanity learned from the catastrophe. Global nuclear energy has become safer. A system of international information exchange on incidents has been created. New safety standards have been developed. Modern reactors have passive protection systems that work even without electricity. The culture of safety has become a priority. Any worker can stop the process if they see a threat. Secrecy gave way to openness, because that is the only way to learn from mistakes. The Fukushima accident in 2011 showed that the lessons of Chernobyl were not in vain. Yes, a catastrophe occurred. A powerful earthquake and tsunami disabled the cooling systems. But the reactor design was safer, the authorities' reaction was faster, and the amount of radioactivity released was 10 times less. There were almost no radiation victims. This does not mean that nuclear energy has become absolutely safe. Complex technical systems always carry risks, but the risks have become manageable, and the system more resilient to errors. Modern parallels are alarming. We live in a world of increasingly complex systems, financial, technological, ecological. Each of them can generate its own black swan. The financial crisis of 2008, the COVID pandemic, climate catastrophes, all this reminds us, complexity breeds vulnerability. Chernobyl teaches, safety must not be sacrificed for efficiency, secrecy is mortally dangerous, and a culture of suppressing problems leads to catastrophe. These lessons are relevant not only for nuclear energy, but for any complex system. And here is the final thesis. Chernobyl accelerated the fall of the USSR, but was not its primary cause. The Soviet system was dying from internal contradictions, inefficient economy, national conflicts, ideological crisis, technological backwardness. All this made collapse inevitable. But Chernobyl determined how exactly this would happen. Without it, the process could have been smoother, more manageable, stretched out over time. With it, swift, chaotic, painful. The catastrophe became a symbol of the system's collapse, a catalyst for processes, an accelerator of history. April the 26th, 1986th year was not the beginning of the end. That end began earlier. But it was a point of no return, after which the collapse became unavoidable. The explosion in Chernobyl echoed in the Kremlin, Kyiv, Minsk, and all the capitals of the Union republics. The radioactive cloud dispersed in months, but the political consequences lasted years and changed the map of the world. The history of Chernobyl is a story of how one event can change the fate of an empire, of how lies destroy trust, and trust is the foundation of any authority, of how a technical failure becomes a political catastrophe, of the fact that in a complex world there are no trivialities. Any crack can become a fault line. Black swan or inevitability? Both. Chernobyl was predictable as a technical accident, but unpredictable as a political catalyst. It could have been prevented at dozens of levels, but systemic logic led precisely to this outcome. It was a coincidence that became an inevitability. And that is why this story is important. It shows how fragile the order of things is, and how crucial it is not to ignore warning signs until it is too late.